No one in Flaxborough felt genuinely excited about the autumn charity concert, though several insisted publicly that they were. It was the sort of event that had always happened, because it always had. An evening of mild applause, ceremonial raffle drawings, and at least 2 performances involving recorders. The town endured it as one endures drizzle, St. Crispin's. Hall itself smelled faintly of varnish and warm, overboiled vegetables, the permanent perfume of any building that served both concerts and women's institute luncheons. Rows of metal-framed chairs had been arranged with an optimism toward attendance not fully justified by the number of tickets sold. Nevertheless, by 7:30 the hall had filled to a respectable 3/4, helped greatly by the fact that the town's more socially ambitious regarded absence as suspicious. On stage, Mrs. Lewisham of the Rotary Ladies' Committee fluttered about with the conscious solemnity of one entrusted with culture. She had introduced 3 choral pieces, 1 piano solo of courageous ambition, and was now directing attention toward the evening's centerpiece, the display of a wedding dress. "It is," she announced, with the solemn intimacy of a toast, "an heirloom garment worn by generations of brides in the Hartlewick family. The lace is handmade, and the gown's final wearer," she paused dramatically, "was the dear late Evelyn Hartlewick." A small, confirmatory sigh passed through the hall, as though the audience felt morally obliged to acknowledge the tragedy. Evelyn had died 2 winters earlier under circumstances politely referred to as a fever, though certain listeners in pews and baking clubs had been willing to tilt their eyebrows more suggestively. When recounting the matter, the dress stood on a mannequin before a screen of paper roses and fairy lights arranged to resemble firelight. Someone thought it artistic, someone else had thought it sentimental. In practice, it made the lace glow faintly amber, which had the uncanny effect of making the mannequin appear warm, alive, almost breathing. Thus situated, the dress had become the unofficial star of the evening, overshadowing, even humiliating, the recorder ensemble. At the moment the trouble began, Mrs. Lewisham was beginning a ponderous anecdote about the gown's origin in 1894 when the lights flickered. Not alarmingly, just a mild shiver of electricity, the kind the town accepted as a quirk of local wiring. But a hiss rose from the left side of the hall where the portable stage lighting had been arranged. Then a thin, sweet voice, soft at first, then clearer, as though someone had stepped closer to a microphone that wasn't there. A woman's voice, singing. The audience froze with the instant. Thrilled stillness of people abruptly included in something dramatic. The voice was not loud, but unmistakably near. The words, if they were words, were indistinct, like a hum remembered rather than spoken. Several people instinctively turned toward the wings. No one was there. Someone in the 3rd row whispered, "Lord, preserve us." The voice wavered once and faded. The hall breathed again. After a heartbeat of silence, Mrs. Lewisham, who prided herself on being unflappable even when quite flapped, cleared her throat with exaggerated composure. "Well," she said, "that was one of our recorded selections for the interval, slightly premature. Technical error. Do continue enjoying the display." No one believed a word of it, but the audience, having no protocol for spectral serenades, pretended they did. Only one person moved, a man near the aisle, the music teacher. Mr. Dennis Calder stood abruptly, face pale and eyes fixed on the dress. He stayed that way only a moment before stepping outside into the corridor. He was followed, a short while later, by murmurs. By the time the raffle prizes were distributed, a hamper, 2 tins of biscuits, and the ill-starred crocheted tea cosy donated every year and always won by someone relieved to be donating it again next season. The atmosphere had frayed into speculation. Whose voice was it? Did anyone recognize the tune? Why did Calder look as though he'd seen a ghost? After the audience dispersed, the hall committee bustled about in the practiced half-dither of people who wished to seem useful while being chiefly worried. Chairs clattered. Paper roses drooped. The dress now seemed unhelpfully more present than ever. Inspector Purbright arrived quietly. He had not been summoned. He had merely been passing the hall on what he would later describe, with honesty, as an entirely unexciting walk home. Purbright had one of those faces that suggested attentiveness without requiring display. He listened to Mrs. Lewisham's agitated account, nodding politely, eyes moving only once toward the dress. At length he asked, very mildly, "Was the gown stored locally?"
"In the Hartlewick estate," she replied.
"We collected it earlier this afternoon." And who handled it?"
"Oh, myself, Mrs. Roach, and Mr. Calder assisted with arranging it." Purbright's gaze did not sharpen.
It simply settled like dust, finding its natural level. "Mr. Calder seemed upset this evening?" Mrs. Lewisham hesitated. Her social instinct collided with her need to be helpful. "Yes. Well, he and Evelyn Hartlewick were acquainted." The inspector said nothing for several seconds. The silence was not heavy nor suggestive.
"It simply encouraged Truth to step into it. Acquainted?"
he repeated gently. Mrs. Lewisham coloured. "They were engaged."
"Very briefly."
"Before everything
happened?" Purbright nodded once. The dress stood warm in its imitation firelight, the lace faintly glowing.
The hall was nearly empty now, and someone had switched off the overhead lamps, so only the low amber bulbs remained. In that dimness the mannequin no longer looked alive. It looked watched. Purbright folded his hands behind him. "I wonder," he said quietly, "whether Mr. Calder might be willing to speak with me tomorrow." By morning, the event at St. Crispin's Hall had already passed from incident to story, a transformation that in Flaxborough required approximately 8 hours, 2 retired school teachers, and 1 early opening bakery queue, the Market Square, still glistening faintly from the previous night's drizzle, bustled in its usual, almost civic choreography. Stalls of modest ambition offered apples, jam jars, and root vegetables whose shapes hinted that the growers valued character over elegance. The butcher's window displayed cuts of meat in a hierarchy of prices no outsider could decode. Pigeons strutted with the proprietary air of local councillors. Most importantly, the voices had begun. Mrs. Copplestone, who considered herself something of a central dispatch for all matters of public importance, stood near the clock tower, retelling with the confidence of someone who had not been present but was certain she understood everything. "I said at the time," she announced to a group of credulous listeners, "that young Dennis Calder wasn't right in the head. The way he dotes over that violin of his. Men who brood over instruments are never reliable. It's all emotion and no proper sense." No one questioned either her authority or her psychological methodology. Meanwhile, across the square near the greengrocer's, Mr. Sherrard was shaking his head solemnly. No, it's obvious what it was. The dress had absorbed her essence, see? That Evelyn, she was a Hartlewick, and everyone knows that family has a history of— He leaned forward dramatically. "Intensity." This last word was spoken in a tone that suggested witchcraft, politics, and possibly continental philosophy. Within the bakery, 2 women debated the matter with almost scholarly gravity. "Well, I heard that Evelyn used to sing," said one. "She did. And before she died, tragically, you know, she sang that very tune." "Which tune?" "That tune." Only one individual in the market remained untouched by the drama. Inspector Purbright. He entered the square wearing the expression of a man who is entirely prepared to overhear things without appearing to do so. His coat was unremarkable, his pace steady. Even his eyes seemed politely interested, but never prying. Flaxborough residents often spoke freely around him, as one might around a comfortable bookcase. His first stop was neither Mr. Calder, nor Mrs. Lewisham, nor the Hartlewick estate. It was the Copper Kettle Tea Shop. The tea shop and the ladies of certainty inside. The Copper Kettle The air smelled faintly of warm scones and mild disapproval. 3 women sat at the corner table, important not because of who they were individually, but because they sat there every weekday, forming what local law referred to as the Council of Unofficial Truth. Purbright approached with the diplomatic neutrality of a man stepping into a garden with a beehive nearby. "Good morning, Mrs. Greaves, Mrs. Allerton, Miss Polk." The 3 greeted him in tones that hovered between affection and suspicion. "We were just discussing the dreadful haunting," Mrs. Greaves said, with the contentment of one unveiling a particularly good scone. "Haunting," said Purbright mildly, allowing the word to float. "Well, what else would you call it?" Miss Polk leaned forward. "The dead bride sang right there in the hall in front of everyone."
I heard she was wronged, you know.
"Women don't haunt unless they've been wronged." "A reliable guideline," Purbright said. Mrs. Allerton lifted her teacup with the solemnity of a ceremonial toast.
I blame Calder.
"Fine head of hair like that, always a sign of temper." "Did you speak with Mr. Calder at all?" Purbright asked. "Oh, no," Mrs. Allerton said briskly. "But I observed him from across the room very carefully. His eyes were the eyes of a man remembering something terrible. Perhaps the raffle," said Purbright. They stared at him to determine whether this was humour. Deciding it was, they allowed a gentle, dignified titter. "What I actually wish to know," Purbright continued, "is whether any of you recall Evelyn Hartlewick well." Mrs. Greaves spoke first, in the tone of one commenting on slightly overripe fruit.
She was, delicate. Nice enough.
"I always thought her marriage prospects were a bit optimistic." "Because of her temperament?"
Asked Purbright. Because of her mother, the 3 said at once, in overlapping harmony. Purbright nodded.
It was the nod of a man who did not yet know the mother, but understood everything anyway. "Thank you," he said gently, and left them feeling both flattered and faintly used. Mr. Dennis Calder, the music teacher, lived in a narrow brick terrace not far from the library. He answered the door with the expression of a man startled from thought rather than sleep. His eyes had the distant, reflective quality of someone recently reminded of grief. Purbright did not immediately mention the previous evening. "Good morning, Mr. Calder. I wondered whether you might spare a few minutes." Calder stepped aside automatically, like someone performing a remembered politeness. The sitting room was tidy, modest, and arranged with the delicate caution of someone who feared making imposition upon space. A violin case rested on a chair. Its presence felt almost personal, as though a guest was sitting quietly among them. Purbright waited until they were both seated and the silence had matured just enough to allow
Sincerity. You left the concert rather.
Suddenly, he observed. Calder looked down at his hands. "Yes, I
Wasn't expecting.
His voice faltered. "Her voice?" Purbright offered gently. Calder swallowed.
No, not her voice.
"The song." There was something so understated, so exhausted in the way he said it, that the moment did not feel theatrical at all. "What was the song?" Purbright asked. Calder hesitated. His eyes went to the window where late morning clouds loitered like half-made promises. "It was something we made up. Between us."
No one else knew it.
"Not her family."
Not anyone. Silence again.
But this time it sat differently, as though it were watching them. Purbright did not lean forward, nor narrow his gaze, nor adopt any of the expressions beloved by melodramatic detectives. He simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that truth often disliked being rushed. After a long, quiet moment, he asked, "Where was the gown kept before last night?"
At the estate, Calder replied.
"In the attic wardrobe."
I used to... He stopped.
Corrected himself. "I helped retrieve it when Mrs. Lewisham asked." Purbright nodded once, his expression untroubled and unreadable. "And did you notice anything unusual then?" Calder opened his mouth, closed it again, and stood up too quickly, knocking the chair leg. "Yes," he said at last. "But I can't—" "Sounds absurd." Purbright's voice was very soft. "Absurdities are only mysteries without context.
Tell me anyway. Calder looked at him with something close to pleading. There was soot, he said,
Inside the wardrobe.
as though someone had burned something nearby.
But there's no fireplace there.
And the Hartlewicks don't heat the upper rooms. Purbright's gaze did not sharpen. It's simply
Settled, Inspector Purbright always believed, that when attempting to understand the emotional weather of Flaxborough, one ought to begin with the organisations that ran entirely on sentiment and sherry. Thus, late that same afternoon, he made his way to the Flaxborough Bridal Preservation and Tradition Society. It was housed in a converted Georgian residence on Willett Street, its windows draped with lace curtains that had not been cleaned recently enough for lace. The sign, painted in a shade of hopeful lavender, read, "Eternal Elegance, Bridal and Heritage Consultation, by appointment or happy chance." Purbright entered to the faint aroma of lavender sachets, furniture polish, and the unmistakable sharpness of social rivalry. The ladies of the society Mrs. Roach, tall, upright, and with a posture that suggested her skeleton had been inherited from a cavalry officer, greeted him at once. Her voice was clipped but not unkind. Inspector Purbright. "We were expecting you," she said, which was untrue but gratifying. Two additional women were already seated at the round tea table. Miss Millicent Chubb, the society's treasurer, whose general demeanour implied she suspected everyone of misusing funds, even when there were no funds to misuse. Mrs. Deirdre Spanley, secretary and coordinator of bridal sentiment, a title she wore like a coronation, who had the soft, damp-eyed expression of someone always on the verge of remembering something sadly poetic. "A tragic business," Mrs. Spanley sighed, gesturing dramatically toward the lace display racks. "Poor Evelyn, such a sweet girl, such frailty."
Such. She searched for a delicate word and found instead a revealing one. Misjudgment. Misjudgment.
Purbright repeated mildly, as though identifying an unusual flower. Mrs. Spanley squirmed. "Well, love can cloud one's wisdom," Mrs. Roach interjected. "This is about the singing, I assume." "The reported singing," she delivered. Reported with the forensic disdain of someone carving falsehood away with a paring knife. Purbright inclined his head. "There was indeed an unexpected vocalization," Miss Chubb snorted. "That means Calder. If there's unexpected vocalization in Flaxborough, it's always Calder. The man's a romantic." "That's never healthy," Mrs. Spanley tutted. He adored her. "Yes," Miss Chubb replied. "And that didn't work out well for anyone, did it?" Purbright allowed a small pause to gather meaning. "You all knew Evelyn well?" he asked. "Well enough," Mrs. Roach replied briskly. "She joined the society when she was engaged, wanted to preserve the wedding gown tradition."
She was impressionable. Impressionable how?
Mrs. Spanley folded her hands as though remembering a difficult sermon. She tended to take things into her heart too quickly. Music, affection, dreams. She was the sort who believed sentiment was meaning, and meaning was destiny. "It's a dangerous way to operate in a town where most people's destinies are decided by property lines and Sunday roasts," Miss Chubb added dryly. "She loved as though she only had one life to do it in." Mrs. Roach shot her a glance.
Millicent. What?
"It's true. And look where loving got her." Silence fell, not awkward, but heavy, like coats being put aside before confession. Purbright kept his expression thoughtful and neutral. "And the wedding gown," he said quietly. It had been in storage for 2 years, yet when it was retrieved, there was soot. All three women sat up slightly. Their stillness was immediate and revealing. Mrs. Roach's voice was very calm. "There should not have been soot," Miss Chubb muttered. "If someone opened that wardrobe without gloves—"
"I will be livid." Mrs. Spanley's eyes widened with something very close to fear. "Inspector."
"You don't suppose someone interfered with it?" "No," Purbright said softly. "I don't suppose anything yet. But the women had already begun to think. They looked at one another in the sudden, sharp way of people who know past things that have never been admitted aloud. Mrs. Spanley leaned forward. There was an incident just before Evelyn passed, something not widely spoken of. The Hartlewick household was not entirely harmonious. Mrs. Roach's mouth tightened. She clearly disliked the turn. Purbright waited, hands folded loosely, face composed like a piece of quiet furniture. Miss Chubb spoke, surprisingly gentle now. There were arguments, she said, between Evelyn and her mother.
About the marriage, about history, and ownership. Ownership? Purbright repeated. Yes, Miss Chubb said.
The dress. It was more than clothing in that family. It was a claim. The bride who wore it became the keeper of the Hartlewick legacy. The house, the land, the old debts, the stories. Mrs. Spanley shivered in that self-satisfying way of people who enjoy a little Gothic detail in their heritage. Oh, it was practically medieval. A bride didn't just marry into the family. She inherited its ghosts, Mrs. Roach exhaled sharply. Deirdre, enough! But the meaning had already landed. Purbright rose, thanked them, and allowed himself to be seen leaving in thoughtful silence. Outside, the afternoon was growing dim, autumn light thinning into its copper edges. From the society's doorstep, one could see the rooftops of Flaxborough, tidy, practical, and deeply uninterested in melodrama. Yet inside those houses, people remembered things, and soot in a forgotten wardrobe was not nothing. Purbright did not hurry. He walked with the thoughtful slowness of someone assembling furniture without the benefit of instructions. He stopped at the corner, where the church tower cast its long, familiar shadow over Willett Street. He thought of Calder,
of Evelyn Hartwick, of a gown stored in silence,
and of a voice that sang in Firelight. Mr. Dennis Calder had not always been described as tragic, though Flaxborough had a habit of applying character summaries retroactively. Before Evelyn Hartlewick's illness and passing, he had been known chiefly as the sort of music teacher who cared deeply about tone and very little about punctuality. He walked everywhere, slowly, as though listening for something no one else could hear. Students found him gentle, if occasionally distracted. Their parents found him tolerably polite and modestly priced. He had, in short, achieved that most Flaxborough-like state, unremarkable acceptability. Then Evelyn died, and acceptability curdled into sympathy. Sympathy, in turn, congealed into rumour, and rumour, once set, hardened with the permanence of stone facing. And now, after the singing, people spoke of him with widened eyes and lowered voices, the way one speaks of forgotten wells and locked attic rooms. Purbright calls again. Inspector Purbright returned to Calder's house the following morning. The street was quiet, the sort of quiet that contains observation. Curtains in the row of terraces moved with the slow, cautious precision of people determined to look without being seen to look. Calder answered the door more composed than the previous day, though a faint look of sleeplessness clung to him like mist. "Inspector," he said, with something between resignation and relief. Purbright inclined his head politely. "If this is a difficult time, I can return later." "No," Calder said quickly. "No, please, come in." The sitting room had not changed. The violin case still rested on the chair, not carelessly, but as though it had been placed there to remain close yet untouched. Purbright sat. Calder did not. He stood by the window looking out, not to observe the street, but to avoid the weight of questions. "I've been thinking," Calder said, in a voice that suggested this was not, in fact, a new development. "A song. It isn't something anyone else would know. We made it up."
"Evelyn and I?" Purbright folded his hands.
"You composed together?" "No, it wasn't composed." Calder smiled faintly. "It was something for the evenings when the fire was low and conversation wasn't necessary."
"A tune that just
"Belonged between us." He paused. "You'll think me sentimental." "Sentiment is merely feeling with memory," Purbright replied. Not a crime in Flaxborough, a nuisance occasionally, but not a crime. Calder gave a small, tired laugh. Then, without invitation, yet without drama, he crossed to the violin case and opened it. He lifted the instrument with a familiarity that was not ownership, but companionship. He did not tune. He simply placed bow to string and played. The melody was simple, soft. It circled itself gently, not quite repeating, the way a flame flickers but does not change shape. It was neither joyful nor sad exactly. It was partial, unfinished, as though waiting for someone else to join it. Purbright listened without reaction, without sentiment, without intrusion. He listened as one observes rain, attentively, without imposition. When the final note dissolved, Calder lowered the bow and closed his eyes. "That's it," he said. "It is not a tune that would be easily recalled," Purbright said. "No." "And there are no recordings?" "None," Purbright nodded once. "So whoever or whatever sang it last night had heard it here." Calder's breath caught.
"I never taught it to anyone. I never would have." Purbright did not speak.
He allowed that truth to settle, then gently. "You mentioned the soot. May I ask again, did it appear disturbed or was it uniform?" Calder blinked, surprised at the shift. Disturbed, smudged, as though something had been placed there recently or taken away. "What sort of thing?" Calder hesitated. "There used to be letters," he said quietly. "Ours. I wrote to her when she stayed at the estate during her illness. She wrote back. They were kept with the gown. She said she wanted our beginning to remain close to our intended future." "And the letters are gone now?" Purbright asked. Calder nodded once. The silence that followed was not emotional. It was structural. A piece, newly slotted into place. The Hartlewick estate. Purbright visited the estate that same afternoon. The Hartlewicks, once a family of unassailable local presence, had dwindled to a single occupant, Mrs. Agatha Hartlewick. Evelyn's mother. The estate, though impressive in age, had the weary look of something maintained out of habit rather than pride. The windows needed washing. The lawn bore a scatter of leaves that had lingered past their welcome. The stone lions at the gate looked less regal than mildly inconvenienced. Mrs. Hartlewick received Purbright in a drawing-room of faded damask and heirlooms arranged with military neatness. She herself was a woman of strong posture and carefully contained composure, like porcelain that had learned not to fall. "Inspector," she said, without smile, "I assume you're here about the performance at the hall." "Performance is one word for it," Purbright replied politely. She did not offer tea. She offered presents, which was intended to be enough. "My daughter was sensitive," she said, with emphasis that suggested sensitivity was both gift and flaw. She felt deeply, too deeply perhaps, a common condition among the living, Purbright said gently. Mrs. Hartlewick's gaze flickered, just briefly, to the empty hearth. "You wish to know about Calder," she said. Purbright did not answer, which was, in itself, answer enough. "He loved her," Mrs. Hartlewick continued. "I do not deny that. But love without strength is a form of hunger."
He needed her, and she, Evelyn, was easily needed. She looked away. Grief can make claims that the living should not have to honour. Purbright let that sit. Then
"There were letters." Mrs. Hartlewick's eyes did not move. "Yes," she said. "They are gone?" "Yes." Purbright waited. Mrs. Hartlewick exhaled slowly.
Not with defeat, but with the deliberate release of restraint. "I burned them," she said.
"Everyone. Yesterday, before the gown was collected. Calder's soot. The missing letters. The song that should not exist outside a memory." Purbright nodded, very gently, very quietly, and said nothing, because now was not the moment to reveal anything at all. The next morning brought a thin, watery sun that seemed to shine merely out of obligation. Flaxborough looked much as it always did, unhurried, tidily self-monitoring, and faintly embarrassed by anything resembling a mystery. Yet there was now a sense of something suspended in the air.
A hesitation.
As though people were waiting to see how much of last night's gossip might need to be converted into respectable recollection. Inspector Purbright began his day at the police station, which smelled faintly of floor polish and the slow despair of paperwork. Sergeant Love was already at his desk, engaged in writing that appeared to be taking enormous effort for relatively small output. He greeted Purbright with the earnest anxiety of a man who feared his thoughts might be visible on his forehead. "Morning, sir."
I heard about the singing," Love said, in the tone of one mentioning a haunting, but hoping it might also be explained by faulty plumbing. "Yes," Purbright replied mildly.
"It's caused a certain amount of community reflection," Love blinked. He always blinked when Purbright said something he suspected was a joke but could not prove. "Is it—"
"A police matter."
Purbright picked up the stack of reports on his desk and leafed through them slowly. "Quite possibly," he said. "Whenever the past refuses to remain politely past, someone generally insists upon making it future." Love blinked again. Purbright closed the file. "Sergeant, we're going to the Hartlewick attic." Love did not look delighted. "The Hartlewick attic, Mrs." Hartlewick did not attempt to prevent the visit. She simply led them up the staircase with the calm resignation of someone accustomed to enduring inquiries and determined to allow nothing to break the surface of her composure. "The attic doorway?" protested, opening with the long, keening groan of wood that had too many thoughts. Inside, the space was tidy in the way of rooms one does not live in but must maintain for appearances.
Old trunks, a cedar wardrobe,
Wedding photographs, bundles of dried flowers from ceremonies whose participants were mostly dead or relocated. The wardrobe stood slightly apart,
as though its mere presence meant something, Sergeant. Love examined it with the careful
politeness of a man afraid of disturbing ghosts. Purbright opened the doors. The interior was clean now, stripped too thoroughly. A faint scent of char still hung in the air, not the acrid sharpness of fresh burning, but the distant, resigned smell of something burned deliberately and without panic. Purbright ran a gloved hand along the inside panel. When he withdrew it, there appeared the faintest smudge of black-grey across his fingertips. Love looked troubled. "So she really did burn the letters," he said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "But not here," Love frowned.
"But the soot was transferred," Purbright said quietly.
"The letters were burned elsewhere. The soot was on her hands when she placed the gown back inside. She didn't think of gloves." Love nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "Mrs. Hartlewick intended to erase her daughter's attachment," Purbright continued.
"Not just grief, attachment. Calder was to be removed from the narrative like a penciled-in word rubbed away before company arrives." Love blinked.
"But the song—" "Yes," Purbright said. "That is the complicating part." He closed the wardrobe door gently, as one might close the lid of a box that still breathed. A small, out-of-place detail Purbright's eye moved, not broadly, but with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to ignoring what is supposed to be there. Near the baseboard below the wardrobe, partly obscured by the leg of an old hope chest, was something that did not match the room, a dark streak, thin, uneven, not dust, not spill, a dragged mark, charcoal rubbed accidentally by something that had caught and then fallen. Purbright crouched. Love, unused to crouching in dress trousers, crouched after him with considerable internal commentary. Purbright examined the mark without touching it. "This," he said softly, "did not happen 2 days ago." Love leaned closer. "From before the dress was taken?" "From the night Evelyn died," Purbright said. Love's breath stilled. Purbright remained quiet. Then, she was here.
In the attic.
That night, Mrs. Hartlowick, who had been standing very still in the doorway, spoke at last. She came up here late, she said, voice almost serene. She said she wanted to look at the gown, to remind herself what she would become.
I thought it was nerves.
Cold feet, a girl's melodrama. I told her to sleep.
I left her alone. Purbright did not look at her. He looked at the wardrobe. And when you returned?
Mrs. Hartlowick's voice did not break. It thinned. The fire had gone out in the drawing room. She must have carried a candle. There were ashes on the floor.
Scorched paper.
She had burned something herself.
A letter, perhaps. A breath.
She was crying.
And she told me she had changed her mind. There are quiet sentences that are louder than screams. This was one. Calder, staring at the gown.
The song only the two of them knew. The mother who burned letters to erase the relationship. But Evelyn burned something first. Something of her own. Purbright stood slowly. Mrs. Hartlowick, he said. Why did she change her mind? The woman closed her eyes. Because, she whispered, she learned something. About the past she was marrying into. Purbright said nothing, because silence now was an instrument. The odd detail that stuck as they left the estate. Love finally spoke what had been worrying him since they found the soot marks. If Evelyn burned something that night, then the singing. Purbright looked up toward the sky, where an October light was losing its colour. Yes, he said softly. Whatever happened at that concert was not grief.
Echoing, love swallowed. It was memory.
Trying to finish a sentence that was never allowed to end. Flaxborough was never short of opinions, merely of facts. By the third day after the concert, the town's gossip had reached what might be called its layered phase, in which storytelling ceased to resemble events and became, instead, a creative collaboration undertaken by the whole community. One version now held that Mr. Dennis Calder had been rehearsing séances in his sitting
room ever since Evelyn's passing.
Another insisted that the Hartlowick wedding gown was haunted, but only on alternate Thursdays when the veil lay correctly.
A third claimed that the singing was unquestionably Evelyn's doing, but in protest.
Not longing. Meanwhile, the truth remained its own quiet creature, moving slowly when no one bothered to look. A visit to the library, Inspector Purbright, instead of revisiting the Hartlowick estate or questioning Calder again, went to the Flaxborough Public Library, not out of literary curiosity, but because Mrs. Lamb, the head librarian, knew absolutely everything that had ever been written, recorded, observed, whispered, or poorly rhymed within town limits. Mrs. Lamb was a small,
wiry woman with spectacles that magnified her eyes to the approximate earnestness of a thoughtful owl. "You're looking for history," she said, without greeting, as Purbright entered.
No one ever visits without purpose. Purbright inclined his head. The Hartlowick family papers.
I believe they kept personal correspondences, household records, and event logbooks.
Mrs. Lamb nodded. Second floor. Cabinet marked H, just below heterogeneous deportment. A thrillingly underborrowed volume. She paused, then lowered her voice with theatrical discretion. There are gaps in the Hartlowick files.
Not from neglect.
From intention. Purbright did not ask how she knew. Because this was Mrs. Lamb, she simply knew. The cabinet of absences, the Hartlowick files were neatly labelled, but noticeably incomplete. Letters referenced events whose dates were missing, conversations whose replies were absent, and family announcements that trailed off just before becoming interesting. Purbright read slowly, not for data but for implications. There was, quite plainly, a pattern of erasure. Not the hurried removal of scandal, but the curated pruning of memory, an archivist's attempt to sculpt a more flattering past. Love, who had accompanied him, frowned deeply. "Sir, why would a family remove their own history?" Purbright closed the folder gently. "To avoid repeating it," he said, "or to prevent others from doing so." Meanwhile, elsewhere, Flaxborough's church choir rehearsal was in disarray. Miss Emmeline Bracegirdle, choir leader and self-applied arbiter of moral tonality, had halted rehearsal for the third time to condemn that shameful display at the hall. "If we invite the past back in song," she said, "do not be surprised when it arrives wearing your curtains." This remark was not entirely understood, but it sounded pious and cautionary, which was enough. Sitting near the back, pretending to be fussing with sheet music, was Mrs. Clara Gooding, the seamstress who maintained wedding gowns and baptism veils in Flaxborough. She was not normally one to attend rehearsals, but she had opinions to collect and possibly provide. When the break arrived, Mrs. Gooding moved to stand beside Miss Bracegirdle with a confidence born of long familiarity with satin and scandal. "Terrible business. The singing," she said. Miss Bracegirdle stiffened. "Spiritual mischief." "Entirely preventable," Mrs. Gooding nodded.
"Oh yes, always is."
"Especially when families try to keep certain matters quiet." Miss Bracegirdle turned, hungry. "What matters?" Mrs. Gooding lowered her voice. There was an engagement before Calder. Miss Bracegirdle's teacup visibly trembled, though it was not currently holding tea. "Who?" Mrs. Gooding blinked with exaggerated innocence. "Oh."
"I couldn't possibly say." Then she
"Did. Mr. Leonard Vale." This landed like a hymn. Sheet dropped in the silence before a sermon. Leonard Vale? Local. Councillor. Upright, energetic, man who campaigned for stricter traffic signage near school crossings and occasionally overwatered. Sympathy. If he had once been engaged to Evelyn Hartlewick, no one had heard him mention it because he had not, because he had erased it. Purbright makes a social call. Leonard Vale's home was modern by Flaxborough standards, brick.
neat, aggressively well-tended garden.
The kind of dwelling that wished very badly not to be noticed, and therefore was noticed constantly. Vale answered the door with the precise smile of a man who practiced charm in the mirror. "Inspector, what a pleasure."
"Come in, do."
The councillors were only just discussing road management. "Perhaps you'd like to join the next session?" Purbright regarded him with mild sympathy. "I fear my duties call elsewhere."
"I simply had a brief question." Vale gestured, all grace and smoothness. "Ask away." Purbright waited just long enough to make
"Silence feel like a choice. You were once engaged to Evelyn."
Hartlewick. Vale froze. The stillness
Was so complete it was almost elegant. Then carefully he breathed. "That was a long time ago." "Yes," Purbright agreed, "but not so long that the memory has cooled." Vale's eyes shifted, not evasively, but with the calculation of a man considering which truth to offer. "It ended," he said simply. "We were young."
and she was idealistic. A common flaw, Purbright murmured. Vale looked at him sharply. "I didn't end it."
"She did," Purbright nodded. After discovering something she had not known before, Vale's jaw tightened. "You're suggesting I wronged her?" "I am suggesting," Purbright said gently, "that she learned something that caused her to burn a letter." Vale flinched. Subtle, barely there, but present. Purbright saw it. He did not press. He simply stood. "Thank you for your time," he said warmly, and left. Love. Now uneasy as they walked away, Sergeant Love spoke in a low voice. "So it wasn't just Calder. She left one man to love another." "Yes," Purbright said. "And it cost her something." "Yes." Love swallowed. "Sir."
The singing.
Purbright's gaze moved to some far window where thought lived. "Memory," he said. "Memory that resists erasure, even when burned." The disturbance began just after 11 on a Wednesday night. a time when Flaxborough was ordinarily engaged in its preferred civic activity, being asleep while fully aware of everyone else's business. A thin column of smoke rose from behind St. Crispin's Church, not enough to alarm the town, but enough to make the street lamps flicker against it in a way that suggested something quietly amiss. It was Mr. Frampton, caretaker, groundsman and unofficial church sentinel, who noticed. He had been locking the side vestry when he caught the scent of burning that was too sharp to be wood and too faint to be cooking. He followed it to the rear alley where the small storage shed used for seasonal pageants was smouldering at one corner, not blazing,
Not threatening, just
reminding. Frampton extinguished the smouldering plank himself with a bucket and an air of weary judgment. He did not panic. He merely telephoned the police station with the same tone one might use to report a broken fence post, slightly inconvenienced and mildly offended by the universe. By the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived, the smoke had thinned to a thin, sour ribbon. Frampton greeted them with the solemn disapproval of a man who had caught the world behaving badly while he was not looking. "Someone set the fire," he said at once. "Not a big one. A message sort," Purbright nodded. The shed door, though scorched, had not burned through. The lock hung open. Love examined the latch. There was no sign of force. "Someone had a key," Love murmured. "Yes," Purbright said softly, "or someone who knew where keys were left." The shed interior was a jumble of wooden props, folding screens, crepe banners, Mary and Joseph costumes in various states of fading, and a series of paper lanterns that had been used once for a rather regrettable harvest festival. But what caught Purbright's attention was the cleared space. A neat, bare rectangle on the floorboards where something had once been set, displayed or stored, and now was conspicuously absent. Love noticed it too. Something was taken, yes, Purbright said, and something was meant to be seen burned, but not destroyed. Frampton, who had been waiting for exactly this sort of cue, supplied the final detail. "That's where we kept the kneeling dais," he said. "The one Evelyn Hartlewick used at her confirmation. Her mother had it polished every spring." Purbright nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who has found the missing step in a staircase and is now very slightly concerned about where it leads. The meaning of burning love looked pained with the effort of thought. "Sir, I don't understand."
why take the dais?
"But burn the shed instead?" Purbright answered quietly, not lecturing, but thinking aloud. "To draw attention," he said.
Not destroy, not conceal.
"But signal. Someone wants us to know that a piece of Evelyn's life has been removed from church keeping and placed somewhere else." Love frowned harder. "But who's the message for?" "Us." Purbright considered before replying. "For someone who already knows exactly what it means." "We're only observers," Love blinked. That didn't help him at all. Whispering windows by morning, every household facing the church lane knew about the fire. By breakfast, the tale included a hooded figure, a second voice joining the first in hymn, a candle left burning in the vestry, and, my personal favourite, the Archangel Gabriel's footprint in the flower bed. Purbright ignored all of it. Instead, he visited Mrs. Clara Gooding, the seamstress. Her shop smelled of starch and careful sentiment. Ribbons hung from racks like polite, decorative conspirators. Mrs. Gooding herself greeted Purbright with a practised expression of gentle sorrow, one she used to sell sympathy along with hemming services. "Inspector."
Terrible, terrible business about the fire. Of course it must be connected. Purbright gave a small, courteous nod.
"You knew Evelyn's measurements, I imagine?" Mrs. Gooding blinked with polite surprise.
Naturally, I altered the gown after her engagement.
"Both times," Purbright did not blink. "Both times." Mrs. Gooding realized, too late, The significance of what she'd said, she recovered poorly. I meant, there was Calder, and then later, before that. Leonard Vale, Purbright said gently. Mrs. Gooding inhaled sharply.
Not guilt, relief? Yes, she broke it off.
For Calder. Her mother did not approve.
But then, I suppose...
There were things said. Things, Purbright repeated, as though cataloguing a word. Mrs. Gooding's eyes glistened with the pleasure of telling a truth she had waited to tell. Well, there were stories about Vale's father.
But why the Hartlewicks refused the match?
Something about...
Not the right kind of inheritance. Money?
Reputation, family history. Mrs. Gooding glanced toward the door, then the window, then leaned in. Blood, she whispered. Silence settled, soft as ash. Purbright did not react. Not yet. The choir loft that evening. Purbright returned to St. Crispin's and climbed to the loft alone. The church was empty now, just dust.
Motes and deliberate silence. He stood where the singing had once risen. He closed his eyes, not to conjure ghosts, but to listen to the
memory of space, not what had been sung, but why it had been heard. He opened his eyes again. Someone, he murmured, is not mourning Evelyn Hartlewick. His voice was very quiet. Someone is arguing with her. Meanwhile, elsewhere the missing dais, polished smooth by kneeling devotion, was seen that night, not in church, nor in any household, but in the window of the old parish mission house, where no one had lived in years, just long enough to be noticed, just long enough to be remembered. Then the candle inside went out, and the window turned dark. Inspector Purbright did not believe in ghosts. He did, however, believe in memories that people attempted, sometimes desperately, to make behave. And he knew well that memory was rarely obedient. It returned, not when invited, but when summoned by fear, guilt, longing, or unfinished conversations. The next morning, Purbright walked alone through the churchyard. The grass was damp, the stones leaned comfortably in their softened rows, and the crows watched with the alert indifference of creatures who have seen more grief than men and expected no variation. The missing kneeling dais, polished, personal, sacred in the quiet way church objects often were, lingered in Purbright's thoughts.
Why take that?
Not because it was valuable, not because it was evidence, because it meant something to someone, something unfinished. Flaxborough's crimes were rarely about money. They were almost always about possession, of reputation, of narratives, of how the past was allowed to exist. Purbright stopped beside Evelyn's grave. It was modest. The stones simple, the inscription restrained, the flowers orderly, too orderly.
No one had left anything spontaneous here.
No single wilting bloom placed by a grieving hand. No music teacher's tribute. No mother's trembling thought at dusk. Grief had been curated. He stood there only long enough to know that he must now
speak to Calder again, but gently. Not as a suspect, but as someone
who might know the shape of a wound neither of them had yet named. The music teacher's house again. Dennis Calder answered the door slowly this time, not because of reluctance, but because he seemed to move as though underwater. His eyes were clearer today, though not less tired.
As if each night handed him the same memories in slightly different order. "Inspector," he said. Purbright nodded once.
"May I come in?" The sitting room was unchanged, though the violin had been returned to a shelf. Not neglected, merely put where it could not speak without invitation. Purbright did not sit immediately. He remained standing, so Calder did not feel questioned, only addressed. "Evelyn burned a letter," Purbright said softly.
On the night she changed her mind, Calder looked up sharply. Pain first, then recognition. "Yes," he said. "You knew of it?" "I did." Silence, but not a cold one.
more like the quiet presence of an old friend who understood without being told. Calder moved to the window, as he always did when his thoughts turned inward. "She came to me the next morning," he said.
She said she loved me.
Said she had chosen me, but she was shaking. I asked her why. She couldn't say. "And so you did not ask again?" Purbright said gently. "No," Calder whispered. "I was afraid if I asked, she would think I did not trust her."
And I thought,
"Love should not interrogate." Purbright considered that, kindly. "But love also does not hide," he said. Calder closed his eyes. Yes, there was no accusation in the room, only the soft weight of things unfinished. Purbright spoke again, very quietly. "Do you know Leonard Vale?" Calder nodded. "I knew of him. He and Evelyn were to be married once. Before me, she ended it. Her mother did not approve. And Evelyn?" Purbright asked. "She was—" Calder searched for a word that contained sorrow, admiration, longing, and bewilderment all at once. Brave. Purbright allowed that word to settle. It was the right one. Ownership. Purbright left. Calder, with a gentle nod, and walked back through town at the measured pace of someone thinking not about people, but with them, he reflected as he often did, not on motives or opportunities or means. Those were the tools of tidy crimes. Flaxborough rarely offered those. No, its crimes were human. A love that outran one person's courage. A family legacy held too tightly. A choice someone was not ready to wear, like a gown that fit in size but not in heart. The Hartlewick gown, in its soft firelight, the letters burned to erase affection. The kneeling dais missing from the church, where vows were once imagined. The song that returned, not as haunting, but as refusal. Someone was refusing to let Evelyn's story be rewritten. Someone was saying, "This is not how it happened. You do not get to remember her without remembering me, and I will not rest politely in silence while you tidy me away." Purbright stopped beside the river, where the willow branches trailed the water like thoughts lingering after speech. He spoke aloud, softly. When a story is taken, people do not seek justice. They seek restoration. The parish mission house. The old mission house had once been used for youth groups, Bible study, and the occasional well-meaning craft night that resulted in glitter lodged between pew hymnals for years afterward. It had been empty now for nearly a decade, only opened for storage or meetings no one wished to publicize. Yet last night a candle had burned inside, placed deliberately, framed by the window.
visible from the road. Purbright stepped inside now.
Accompanied by Frampton, who had been waiting, broom held as though to defend the building's virtue. The air inside was still, thick with dust and the faint, sweet scent of wax. In the centre of the room, placed where the eye must land upon entry, was the kneeling dais. No vandalism, no damage, just presence, as though someone were saying, "Kneel here, remember correctly, say her name as she was." Purbright ran his hand along the polished wood. The grain was worn smooth by years of devotional touch. It was, unmistakably, a gesture of love, not rage.
Not accusation.
Love that had nowhere else to go. Frampton shifted uneasily. "What does it mean, sir?" Purbright spoke softly. "It means the story is not over." "Someone is still speaking," Frampton swallowed.
A ghost?
"No," Purbright said, and his voice, quiet as it was, filled the room. "A living person who refuses to let Evelyn Hartlewick be forgotten incorrectly." A moment of stillness that evening. Purbright sat alone at his desk, a single lamp lighting his paperwork. His pen hovered. His thoughts were not neat, but they were ordered. He understood now. This was not a haunting. This was possession, not of the supernatural kind, but of memory. Evelyn had loved twice, and both loves had demanded to own her. She had burned one truth. Her mother had burned another. Someone now was restoring what both had tried to hide. The past was returning, not to accuse, but to be seen. The copper kettle was busier than usual that afternoon. Rain spotted the window panes in slow, deliberate droplets, giving the market square outside a slightly softened watercolour look. Flaxborough did not dislike the rain, it simply accepted it as expression of weather's polite boredom. Inside, the usual cluster of patrons sat where they always sat, Mrs. Greaves with her purposeful knitting, Miss Polk with her notebook of minor grievances, Mrs. Allerton stirring tea as though diagnosing it. They looked collectively up as Inspector Purbright entered, though none of them would admit to having done so. He gave them a nod of mild politeness, the exact amount expected of a gentleman entering a room of seated observers, and took a small table near the window. He did not order immediately. He waited. He knew that waiting in Flaxborough always drew precisely the company he wanted. Sure enough, the doorbell chimed, and in came Councillor Leonard Vale. He saw Purbright at once. There was a flicker across his face, not guilt nor fear, but the brief tightening of someone bracing for conversation they can neither avoid nor fully prepare for. He approached with a composed smile. "Inspector, mind if I join you?" Purbright gestured to the chair across from him. By all means, they sat. A pot of Earl Grey was brought. 2 cups. No sugar, no milk. Vale poured with that same practiced precision. He applied to most public acts. Purbright did not speak yet. He let the silence unfold, just enough to require deciding what to fill it with. Vale chose something neutral. Here the church shed incident caused a bit of concern. "Smoke often does," Purbright said mildly. Vale allowed a thin smile. "Polite but not amused. And have you discovered who was responsible?"
Not yet. The silence after that was deliberate. Purbright's gaze remained gentle, perfectly ordinary.
Vale shifted slightly, not uncomfortable, but alert. Purbright spoke again.
Voice very quiet. "You loved her." Not a question. Vale's breath drew in, small.
Sharp, involuntary, a pause. "Yes," he said at last. There was no tremor in the word. "Just truth." Purbright nodded once. "And she loved you." Vale looked down into his teacup. "Once?" "A moment," Purbright asked softly. "Do you know why she changed her mind?" Vale hesitated, just long enough to reveal the thought was heavy. "She learned something," he said.
Something about my family. Old matters. An inheritance that did not mean money. Reputation, Purbright echoed gently. Vale nodded. A story that followed my father.
The Hartlewicks believed marriage extends legacy, not just property.
They didn't want
What I carried. And Evelyn believed them?
No, Vale said sharply, and here emotion finally entered, held, tamped down, but unmistakable.
She loved me, she did, but she feared what her mother feared.
And Evelyn was, he exhaled, someone who could be persuaded her heart was dangerous. Purbright let that rest. Then you did not contest her decision. No. But the word was not simple.
It was full. Of all the things he had not said then and had said to himself ever since. "She came to me after," Vale said quietly. "Weeks later. She said she was wrong, that she wanted to try again, but by then she was with Calder."
And she thought it would be cruel to undo that. Purbright said nothing. There are silences meant to comfort.
And silences meant to reveal. This was one that revealed. Vale looked up at him. "I would never harm her," he said. The words were not defensive. They were simply exhausted. "I know," Purbright replied. Miss Polk, at the corner table, nearly fell out of her chair attempting to hear this. And Mrs. Allerton steadied her with the elegant force of someone preventing theatre from becoming municipal record. Purbright poured more tea. "We are not discussing Evelyn's death," he said. "We are discussing her memory." Vale blinked. Slowly. Yes, that was exactly it. Purbright's voice remained soft. "Something has been taken from the church. Something significant." Vale's expression did not change. "But something behind it moved." "The kneeler?" he said. Purbright inclined his head. "You knew?" "Yes." "And you know who took it?" Vale closed his eyes briefly. "Not pain."
Not reluctance, recognition, something long expected. "Yes," he said.
"I believe I do." Purbright examined him, not to test, but to understand. "You've been waiting for this," Purbright observed. Vale nodded once. "I knew it would resurface." A breath. "You can't bury something with sentiment alone. It always climbs back out." Purbright leaned back very slightly, not in triumph, for he had none, but in acknowledgement. "The person who took the kneeler," he said softly.
"Loved Evelyn. Yes, loved."
"Her in a way that did not want to let the past be replaced." "Yes, and they are not finished." Vale
Opened his eyes and met Purbright's. "No, they are not." Purbright's tone remained.
"Gentle, Leonard, where is her mother now?" Vale looked out the rain-streaked window. "She has taken to sleeping in Evelyn's old room. She says it comforts her. But I think she is guarding something. I think she knows the past is moving again, and she does not want it to reach her." Purbright nodded, and then he asked a question that did not sound pointed, yet was, "When Evelyn changed her mind, truly changed it, did she tell you why?" Vale hesitated. Then he did something he had not done since the engagement ended. He told the truth. "She said she had been told something. Something her mother wanted kept quiet. Something about the Hartlewick name." Purbright's expression did not change, but the room seemed to lean in. Vale continued. "She said she could not wear the gown."
"Not because of me, because of what it meant."
"What it was tied to." "The bridal gown." "The letters." "The soot, the song." "The kneeler." "Not love triangle." "Legacy." Purbright placed his cup down very gently. "Leonard," he said, almost kindly, "I must ask you, do you believe Evelyn died of fever?"
Vale's jaw clenched once. Then, "No." The room stilled, not theatrically.
Simply, truth stood up in the middle of the tea shop, and everyone felt it. But Purbright did not react, not outwardly. He simply nodded. Once, slowly, like a man acknowledging a name in a long-forgotten ledger. "Thank you," he said, and they both understood the conversation was over. Vale stood. Purbright remained seated. Outside, the rain had stopped. Mrs. Hartlewick agreed to receive Inspector Purbright that afternoon. Her message had been conveyed through the maid with all the clarity of Victorian formality. Yes, the inspector may call. At 4. It was the tone of someone who wished to control the terms of her own reckoning. The drawing-room was as before. Quiet, orderly, every object placed with the precision of a woman who believed control could substitute for peace. Lace curtains softened the late daylight. A piano sat closed. No photographs of Evelyn were displayed. One had to look to the hallway to find her likeness. Mrs. Hartlewick sat upright in her chair, hands folded so gently one might think them still. But her eyes were alert and deeply, privately tired. "Inspector," she said, "I expect you have come to discuss the fire." Purbright inclined his head. "Only in passing. I've come, rather, about Evelyn, and the memories of her that some have tried very hard to keep intact, and others to reshape." A flicker, not fear, recognition. Mrs. Hartlewick did not respond, but her breath changed just slightly. Purbright continued, voice even. Your daughter was preparing to marry Leonard Vale. She ended that engagement. You encouraged her to, strongly. Yes, she said, and shortly after she agreed to marry Mr. Calder. Silence. Purbright's gaze was gentle.
Not accusing.
Simply present, she loved both of them, he said, but in different ways, and while she decided freely, her choices occurred in rooms where other voices spoke very loudly. Mrs. Hartlewick's hands remained folded, but her knuckles had whitened. Purbright's tone softened further. Her decision, however, was not based on affection. Not ultimately. She changed her mind because she learned something about the Hartlewick legacy, something you did not want her to inherit. Mrs. Hartlewick's mouth tightened, but she did not deny it. It is our burden, she said quietly. Ours to bear. The burden of, Purbright said, a family history of melancholy, of what used to be called nervous exhaustion,
Of endings that come too soon.
and of grief that does not recede. Mrs. Hartlewick closed her eyes. She feared, Purbright continued gently, that she would become you. The silence that followed was not still. It was full. Mrs. Hartlewick opened her eyes, and the composure was gone, not shattered, just unshielded. She was so bright, she whispered, so lit from within. But the women of this family, we love too fiercely. We break on love.
I did. My mother did. My grandmother. I saw it coming for her, clearly as winter. And so you tried to protect her, Purbright said kindly. Mrs. Hartlewick shook her head. No, I tried to control her. Her voice trembled. I told her legacy is not choice.
That we are born into our grief, and she must choose a husband who understood that grief. Leonard did not. But Calder would have drowned in her. Purbright let her speak. It was the first time she had spoken truth aloud in years. Mrs. Hartlewick looked up at him with a raw, unadorned expression. When she told me she was choosing Calder, I tried to stop her. I burned the letters.
I tried to close the past. Her voice fell to a whisper.
But she had burned one first. Yes, Purbright said. The one that ended her engagement to Vale. Mrs. Hartlewick nodded. Once. She came to me that night, she said. She said she could not marry either of them. She said love should not feel like choosing whose heart to break, including her own. The room was very still. And the fever? Purbright asked softly. Mrs. Hartlewick's voice was barely sound. She was ill, but she might have mended. If she had not been exhausted by grief, if I had not insisted she choose strength, she did not have it.
And a breath broke.
I mistook fragility for weakness. Purbright bowed his head, not as judgment, as memorial. Mrs. Hartlewick closed her eyes. When I heard the singing at the hall, she whispered, I truly thought for a moment she had come to forgive me. Purbright spoke gently, firmly. It was not Evelyn who sang. Mrs. Hartlewick's eyes opened. Very slowly, terribly, slowly. Understanding entered. Purbright did not move. Someone who loved her, he said, is trying to restore her story, to keep her from being tidied away. Someone who could not bear to let grief be rewritten. Mrs. Hartlewick whispered, Dennis. Not Dennis, Purbright said gently. He grieves quietly. She froze, a pause, a long one. Then her voice, Leonard. Purbright's silence confirmed it. Not rage. Not revenge, memory. Leonard Vale had taken the kneeler.
Lit the candle, placed it in the mission house because...
That was where he and Evelyn had once spoken of a future they would never have. He had not been haunting the town. He had been refusing to let the world believe Evelyn died a woman. Defeated, Mrs. Hartlewick covered her face, with one hand, not weeping, just seeing, finally, the story as it truly was. Purbright rose. Thank you, he said softly. The past is sometimes ugly, but truth, once spoken, is rarely cruel. Mrs. Hartlewick did not stop him as he left. She did not move at all. The matter of the church shed and the missing Neela was handled discreetly. There were no arrests.
No public statements. No calls for formal inquiry.
In Flaxborough, the truth, once acknowledged by those who needed to hear it, rarely sought spectacle. Leonard Vale returned the kneeling deist to the church himself. He did so early in the morning, before the lanes were busy. He walked openly as though carrying a modest piece of furniture, not a confession. Mr. Frampton watched from the vestry door, but said nothing, only nodded once, as one man acknowledging another man's sorrow. The dais was placed gently back where it had always belonged. No scorch marks, no damage, no apology required. No one in the church spoke of it afterward, though every parishioner knew. And knowledge was enough. Mrs. Hartlewick did not leave her house for 3 days. She was not unwell. She was thinking consciously, continuously, with the sort of focus that had once been misapplied to the management of family narratives. When she reappeared, she attended service, not in mourning attire, but in a quiet dress of dark green that Evelyn had once worn in summer. No one commented. They simply made space for her in the pew. Several women brought casseroles in the days that followed. They were returned washed, not refilled. Small gestures, politely exchanged, became the language of forgiveness. Dennis Calder continued teaching music. He played the violin during services now and then, not loudly, never solo, never as performance. He played in a way that suggested memory had found a place to rest without demanding to be kept awake. His students noticed a softening in him, not sadness, not withdrawal, but something gentler, as though he had ceased trying to hold his grief still and allowed it to move with him instead. Children, being practical creatures, simply said, "Mr. Calder is nicer now," which was true. As for Councillor Vale, he did not speak of the past.
Not to defend it, not to claim it, not to explain it.
He began instead taking quiet walks in the evenings, unhurried, unguarded. He no longer crossed the street when he saw Mrs. Hartlewick. They nodded to one another. No words passed, but there was understanding. That was enough. The Hartlewick gown was returned to the attic, but the next season Mrs. Hartlewick brought it back down herself, folded carefully in its preservation box, and gifted it to the Bridal Society for public keeping. Not private legacy, I think, she said calmly. That some things belong to the town now, not the family. Mrs. Roach accepted it with a formality that was almost
reverent. Mrs. Spanley cried softly into one
glove. Miss Chubb merely nodded once and adjusted the box so that the lace lay without strain. In Flaxborough, this was the emotional equivalent of an embrace. The song was not heard again. Not once more, but sometimes. Very faintly in late autumn when the evenings were unusually warm and the hall lights glowed through the windows. Some residents felt that they remembered it, even if they had never heard it played. Memory, when handled kindly, learns to sing quietly, not to haunt, but to stay. Inspector Purbright wrote his report in the modest, dry manner that suggested very little had happened at all. He noted the date, the locations, the individuals spoken to, the conclusions. There was no mention of ghosts, no mention of legacies, no mention of the private economies of love and grief. Those were matters the law did not hold, and should not. When the report was signed and filed, Purbright sat back and watched a thin cloud shift slowly across the evening sky beyond the station window. Sergeant Love, passing by, asked whether anything more needed doing. "No," Purbright said gently.
"Everything now is simply—"
Remembering correctly, Love nodded, not entirely understanding the sentence, but feeling the weight of it, which was enough. Purbright returned to his paperwork, and Flaxborough resumed itself. Not unchanged, just quietly rearranged inside, where change actually happens.